Okay. And okay, so you're very welcome to the Tenants for Climate Justice Forum. So like I said, today we're going to be looking a little bit about the intersections between housing and climate justice and why this is a climate issue and why we think people should care about it, both as a climate justice issue and as a social justice issue. And so if you just go to the next slide. So we're going to be looking at the research regarding the climate, health, and social justice impact of leaky homes. And we're going to be looking at some case studies around specific blocks as well. We're going to be talking about why we're deciding to campaign on the issue of tenants specifically, and why not say, for instance, rural homeowners or other groups that also struggle to access the retrofitting program, and a conversation, like I said, on where the campaign is headed. So this is more of a workshop format where you will have a chance to input and kind of give some insight into the direction of the campaign. So I'll pass over to yourself, Claire, if you want to start presenting some of your research.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so I'll basically go through why Friends of the Earth have been looking at this specific issue of energy efficiency in the rental sector and the social housing sector as well. And I'll talk a little bit about the work that we've done to date and what our demands are what our potential demands are going forward. And it's really great to be able to kind of workshop some of this with you guys tonight. So thanks very much for coming and giving your Wednesday evening to this. So basically, just if anyone hasn't been involved with Friends of the Earth before, we advocate for faster and fairer climate action. I suppose when we're talking about climate action and the climate crisis, 2023 was the hottest year on record, and we really need an immediate and drastic shift away from fossil fuels. So that's kind of the faster aspect of it. But then when we talk about fairer climate action, that we know on a global scale, it's the most vulnerable who will be at the front line of a shock like climate change. And huge transformation is needed to decarbonise our societies. So we need to make sure that as Ireland makes these really big changes, that everyone can benefit and no one is left behind. And one of our campaigns that we've been working on over the past 2.5 years is called Warm Homes for All. And we believe that everyone deserves to live in a warm, comfortable home with affordable energy bills, and that everyone in Ireland can access the benefits of a clean energy transition and a warm, comfortable home. So fossil fuels are globally the biggest contributor to the climate crisis, and our dependence on fossil fuels in Ireland, alongside a really inefficient housing stock, is becoming increasingly costly to low-income households, as we've seen over the past couple of years. I think the energy crisis of the past number of years made that really, really clear to all of us, how costly dependence on fossil fuels plus inefficient housing stock is, and who actually carries the burden of that cost then when we encounter global shocks like the energy crisis. So as I said there, it's people who are already marginalised in certain ways, are often living in the worst housing conditions, are locked into fossil fuel infrastructure, volatile energy prices, and they're not able to access renewable energy or to be involved in the energy transition. So there's a lot of people who, for lots of different reasons, aren't able to get involved in the energy transition and take the steps to get off fossil fuels and to improve their housing quality and ultimately reduce their energy bills. And what we have been doing over the past couple of years is advocating for a national retrofit plan. So retrofit is when you improve the energy efficiency of your home, and we've been calling for a national retrofit plan that includes everyone in it and make sure that no one's left behind in that. And over the past couple of years, we've been working with lots of different organisations who represent those groups who would be locked out of the energy transition and would be struggling with energy costs and inefficient housing. And we've kind of collectively been doing lots of advocacy, and I'll put a little link of some of our joint work into the chat after I finish speaking, so there's too many tabs open at the moment. But we've been collectively advocating for an energy poverty action plan that makes vulnerable households, people in different situations, make sure that they can be involved in retrofitting and the energy transition. And when we look at why people are locked out of these things and why people experience things like energy poverty, there tend to be 3 root causes. And I will say that these causes are, each of these three are huge issues, structural issues, and fuel poverty and energy poverty is just kind of a symptom of each of these core issues. So high energy bills are caused by fossil fuel demand, a dysfunctional energy market, and global shocks like the energy crisis. Poor energy efficiency caused by a poor quality housing stock, lack of housing options available because of the housing crisis, and inadequate or out of date heating systems. And then low incomes as well, caused by inequality and barriers to employment, and poor public policy and social exclusion. So energy poverty, and when we encounter people who are struggling with their energy bills, it's not a personal failure, and it's not something that people can tackle themselves. And it's really the result of long-standing structural and political failings, and requires a really comprehensive government approach across so many different departments, across housing, across social protection, and then across climate and environment as well. So it's a really broad-reaching issue. And then when we look at the specific issue of energy costs over the last number of years, the cost of energy for households rose by 58%, which is about €2,000 per year for a lot of people. And when we look at last year, 10% of people in Ireland went without heat due to cost in 2023. But again, it was people who are in more difficult situations who were most impacted. So that was 1 in 5 one-parent families. It was a quarter of people with disabilities, and a quarter of people who were long-term unemployed who actually had to turn their heating off because they could not afford to keep their home warm last year. So it was really, really significant. And I think in the term energy crisis, there's an third of our households are classified as living in energy poverty. So that's the energy cost issue, and then the inefficient buildings, which I know Sia and Laura will speak to shortly as well. When we look at like the carbon emission situation, buildings contribute to 37% of our annual emissions, and Irish homes emit 60% more CO2 than the EU average. We've got an inefficient housing stock. 80% of homes have a building energy rating of a C or lower. When you actually look at the impact of that on energy costs, this is a bit of a wordy sentence, but the cost of meeting your minimum energy needs can be 55% higher if you live in a low BER household compared to living in a high BER household. So it's quite significant, the difference your housing quality makes to your energy costs. And then when we look at the health impacts of that as well, of energy poverty and inefficient housing, Ireland has one of the highest rates of excess winter mortality in the EU, and 2,800 excess deaths happen every year. And a lot of that is because of poor housing quality and energy poverty. Children in cold homes are over twice as likely to suffer from respiratory conditions. There's a really significant impact on people's mental health as well. And research has shown that if we increase our ambition and scaling up of retrofitting, it could actually generate health and well-being benefits of estimated 600 million every single year. So that's kind of the context. But what has the government done so far on this issue? So they've committed to retrofitting 500,000 homes to a BER, a building energy rating of a B2, and install 400,000 heat pumps by 2030. They've committed to retrofitting a quarter of local authority housing by 2030. They've also committed to introducing minimum BERs in the private rental sector starting in 2025. But that looks like it's not on track to be delivered because they haven't told landlords about it, they haven't told tenants about it, and there's been no actual movement to implement this so far. There was a new energy poverty action plan due out last month, which is not actually now on track to be delivered in the current government term, unfortunately. And then the actual retrofit plan, what does that look like? So there's SEAI grants of 35 to 55% for a deep retrofit of your home, an 80% grant for shallow measures like attic and cavity wall insulation. Also, if I'm talking too technical here, because I'm sometimes in written it, you don't realize. how technical some of this is, but for attic and cavity wall insulation, there's an 80% grant. But for those two, there's still a really significant upfront cost that's totally out of reach for a huge amount of households as well. There's also an SEAI warmer home scheme, which is a free deep retrofit for homeowners who receive specific social welfare payments. That's for homeowners only. And over the last year or two, a tax relief was introduced for landlords to invest in energy efficiency improvements. But we've no data as to how many people have actually done that. There's no data at the moment collected on how many homes that are being retrofitted with SEAI grant money are in the private rental sector at all, unfortunately. And when we look at where or who is in the inefficient buildings or where are they, it is HAP tenants actually are the most likely to be in the least efficient buildings, and local authority homes are not far behind them. And for the private rental sector in general, it's nearly 50% are in a D, E, F, or G home. So it is quite significant. And then within that private rental sector, it's HAP supported tenants who tend to be in the least efficient housing out of all of those. So when we're looking at campaigning in this area, what are we calling for? We are calling for the government to implement the minimum BERs that they introduced in Housing for All a couple of years ago. So that would prevent homes that have a BER of an E or a lower from being put on the rental market from 2026, and to increase that year on year on a phased basis. This has been introduced in the UK and in France as well. That needs to be introduced alongside really strong tenant protections to prevent people from being evicted. Resources also need to be put towards enforcement of minimum BERs, so that local authorities or whoever they decide is doing the enforcement of the minimum BERs actually have sufficient agency to make sure that people are being compliant with them, and looking at new financing strategies as well to support people with retrofit as well for improving energy efficiency. The second one is committing to retrofitting all social housing by 2030. As I said, at the moment, it's only a quarter of social housing units that the government are planning on retrofitting by 2030. We think there should be a much more state-led, proactive retrofit plan that retrofits these homes first. According to our research that we've done with the Irish Green Building Council, they're not currently prioritising the worst performing homes. So they're certain local authorities are retrofitting homes that might be easier to retrofit than the more difficult to do ones. And we think that needs to include solar and renewable heating systems as well, to make sure people aren't being locked into burning fossil fuels for years to come. And at the moment, local authorities only get a 1 year funding to actually do this. And we think there needs to be a multi-annual funding strategy to do this. And then number 3 is, I was talking about the SEAI free retrofit scheme, the warmer home scheme. We want to see HAP tenants included in the free retrofit scheme on the condition of a 5-year lease being offered to the tenant, so that HAP tenants can avail of a free retrofit on the condition that they're there for the long term. So there are demands for the moment. Aaron, are we doing questions now or after?
So after everyone is presented, we'll do questions.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, that's there are my bits. I'll hand it back to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Claire. So yeah, please hold your questions towards the end. I see that there's some questions coming in the chat. That's fine. You can put them in the chat if you want, and we might address them at the end as well. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Fia and Laura, who are going to present on a just transition for housing, looking at particular case studies, mostly in public housing. So take it away.
Cool. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for the invitation to come and talk about the research we're doing. So yeah, I'm just going to talk for, I guess it might be like 10-ish minutes about, I'm sorry, and Laura's going to do a bit after I finish, about this research project that I'm working on, or that we're both working on as staff members in the Department of Geography in Maynooth University. So this is called Just Housing, a Just Transition for Housing. So it's a 3-year EPA funded project in geography and Maynooth. There's myself, Laura, Patrick Bresnan, and then there's a couple of other people working on like spatial analysis and kind of mapping of patterns of retrofitting in Ireland. But yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about the kind of overall project and research work, a little bit about the social housing context in terms of social housing. That will overlap a bit with what Claire's just said, which is really useful as well. And then Laura's going to talk a little bit about some of the case study work that we're doing in Castle Court in Kilmore, which is the picture that's up there on the first slide. Yeah, so if you could change slide there. Yeah, so I guess linked to the name of the project about just transition for housing. The overall aim, I guess, is to understand the implications of sorry, just closing the chat window so I don't get distracted. Understand the implications of like current retrofit policy and practice in Ireland for housing justice. So I guess at a basic level, understanding how it impacts or relates to kind of access to like decent quality, affordable housing. And we're focusing on the question of like the implications of retrofitting for people in different forms of housing tenure. So for doing kind of like case studies or specific bits of research on home ownership, on private renting, and on public housing, kind of based on the idea that like at a basic level, like the power relations are different in each of these forms of tenure. So that's the question of like who is able to make decision to invest or not invest in like improving a property or not. So just to give, I guess, a bit of context, like the total housing stock in Ireland currently, about 65% is owner occupied, 18% private rental, and about 10% social or public. So that's both local authority housing and housing held by approved housing bodies. And yeah, I've just included that statistic about the increase in the size of the private rental sector, I guess, because I mean this is important from the perspective of retrofitting, given that I mean, as I'll come back to, and as Claire has said, there's very little data about rates of retrofitting in private rental, but certainly anecdotally and based on experience in other countries, rates are much lower in private rental. So if the private rental sector keeps expanding, I guess that's going to be an increasingly important issue if no action is taken to stop that trend. Yeah, if you could go on again. Yeah, these are just a couple of quick points about like the state of knowledge and research about retrofitting in Ireland, which is quite limited when it comes to like understanding, I guess, what we're talking about in terms of like the social justice implications and implications for housing justice. So yeah, as Claire mentioned, there's no data about retrofitting rates of retrofitting in the private rental sector, like how much of the state's money is going to private landlords when the or it is potentially when data is linked to this like tax incentive comes out. I think I'd read previously that that would happen sometime the end of this year, so maybe there will be some data available about that in the near future, but that's still likely to, well, I don't know, it's hard to know how that will be provided or what that will tell us, I guess. So yeah, and then there's no information or research about the implications of retrofitting for tenants in the private rental sector. So, I mean, under current rental legislation, it's possible for landlords both to evict or to increase rents on the basis of retrofits. It's currently acknowledged, including in the Housing Commission report, that there's like widespread non-compliance amongst landlords with the requirement to notify the Residential Tenancies Board if there's rent increases in excess of the rent pressure zone limit. So that would be like if there has been a rent increase due to a retrofit, they're meant to notify the Residential Tenancies Board that that's happened. but it's acknowledged that there's no penalties for not notifying the RTB, so it doesn't happen, and that means that there's no data about the extent of this issue. Just off the top of my head, there were figures out earlier in the year about like the very large proportion of rent increases above the RPZ limits, which I guess just illustrates that there's kind of a widespread non-compliance issue. And yeah, there's very limited data about conditions and energy efficiency in local authority housing. So there hasn't been like a national housing stock condition survey since 2001. There's been kind of like limited or ad hoc surveys conducted by different local authorities, but the data and information generated through these has been, well, we found it certainly very hard to access for the areas that we're looking at in Dublin. And then I guess there's limited info about the rollout of the local authority retrofit program. So like what types of units they are prioritizing or not. So yeah, just to say, I guess like some of the work that we've done so far has been kind of carrying out this like overall review of how retrofitting policy and programs have developed since they were first introduced in a kind of recognizable form in around the very late 1990s or early 2000s. So some of the kind of things that like came out of this were just at a one kind of specific point was that like minimum energy standards, energy efficiency standards in the private rental sector have been promised by successive governments and in successive kind of like policy documents since 2009, but never introduced. And I think we can contextualize this as kind of like part of the general lack of regulation in the private rented sector. It's not kind of like isolated issue. And then yeah, like a notable feature is that like when state-backed programs for retrofitting were first introduced in the early 2000s, they were exclusively about addressing energy poverty. And that's progressively changed with the focus becoming more on emissions and climate, which I guess in some ways is understandable, but has also meant that yeah, the focus on energy poverty has been dropped to an extent. Because if the focus is on carbon emissions and climate, it doesn't matter whose energy efficiency or whose homes are upgraded, relative to if the focus is energy poverty. And then just another aspect of another kind of shift or trend has been the development of new like financial products and mechanisms to try and incentivize retrofitting, such as green mortgages, like the ad that's there on the screen, and then a state-backed loan scheme. But these are, well, explicitly targeted at more middle class or higher income homeowners. In the case of the state-backed loan scheme, that's kind of like set out in the policy documentation about it, that it's for kind of like middle and upper income households. Cool. So yeah, I guess just what we are doing in terms of the focus on public housing. Yeah, as Claire mentioned, there's the government target to upgrade 36,500 local authority homes to B or B2 by 2030. Like just at current rates, the government is not on track to meet these targets. So it's an average about 2,500 units per year, and funding levels have been static at around kind of 87-90 million per year for the last few years. And then, I mean, based on the kind of like preliminary interviews as well as the research that Claire mentioned, what we found is that like local authorities are prioritizing houses that are in already better condition, including that have higher energy ratings, because of the way the funding system is structured. So they get like a fixed allocation per house, and costs are much higher if there's like a range of work that needs to be done, and they can't allocate money from that 34,000 to works that are regarded as like enabling works, or things that need to be fixed in order for a retrofit to take place, such as rewiring or replacing or plumbing a house, for instance, if it has had like electric heating and didn't have central heating. And these are works that tend to be, or are often required in older and less well-maintained homes. And yeah, if local authorities want to do these, want to get houses to a point where they could be retrofitted, that would need to come from like the general local authority maintenance budget. And just to take one example, Dublin City Council had an allocation for essential maintenance of €200 per unit in, but actually, sorry, I may be wrong, that was 2023 rather than 2024. I'd have to double check, but it gives you an illustration, like no one's going to be rewiring a house for 200 quid. Yeah, and I guess like a key point to point out here is that like we can kind of start to see how the long-term kind of like disinvestment and yeah, what was called like residualization of public housing, the fact that it's been kind of constructed, or that it's become a kind of poorly maintained small sector of the housing system for the like most vulnerable and marginalized, and that it's been left to rot, like not to put too fine a point in it, is now becoming a really important issue from the perspective of retrofitting. And then I think I've just got one more slide to get through briefly, and then I'll pass on to Laura. But within our project, we're just doing some specific research on the situation with flats in Dublin City Council's administrative area. So there's around 11,000 flats owned by Dublin City Council, of which over 6,000 are more than 40 years old. And I guess while we don't have like detailed energy rating information about all of these are likely to need significant renovations. But there has been effectively no energy efficiency upgrades in flats so far. This kind of like, it's regarded as kind of like a problematic or like difficult type of housing to deal with. There's been a very small number of like pilot projects. There was kind of like a feasibility study in Glover's Court near to Stephen's Green. The council upgraded a single unit in Ballybock House a couple of years ago, and then Castle Court, which we'll come back to in a minute. But just as one example, like the council upgraded one single unit in Ballybock House that cost 270 grand. And prior to that, they'd kind of said like, well, this will be a pilot to learn and provide a model that we will then roll out to other flat complexes. And I think they quickly kind of realized that would not be happening with that kind of cost. And the pilot was discontinued. And currently, like the position is effectively that in order to retrofit the majority or a large proportion of flats, that this will depend on kind of large scale like regeneration projects, which I guess are funded through like a separate Department of Housing funding stream. But this in itself is like really problematic, because like historically there have been estates left decades waiting for regeneration projects, if they transpire at all, as well as in many cases where regeneration has been a means of privatization of a large proportion of public housing stock. Cool. So yeah, I'll pass on to Laura just to talk about the specific Castle research work.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Sorry, my sound is a bit okay. Yeah, so I'll just give a bit of context on the Castle Court case study, and then some concluding remarks. So yeah, as Fia mentioned, so we started fieldwork and surveying in Crown Castle Court, so which is an estate, a public housing estate located in Kilmore, and made of originally eight blocks of apartment. So yeah. Also, as Fia mentioned, so it's one of the rare example of public housing flat complex where some retrofitting work has been done. So that was interesting in that sense for us researchers. So to see how a previous project, retrofit project, was developed in a local authority flat complex, and what was the outcome of the project. So for a very long time, just to give a bit of a history of the place and of the estate. So the complex was built in the 70s, and it's been there has been ongoing campaign to improve and renovate the apartment blocks. In 2007, so the estate was due for regeneration, as many other estates in Dublin. And also the project was abandoned due to the financial crisis. Yeah, and after the giving up the regeneration, so tenants again pushed for more improvement of the estate, and it's when they got the retrofit project conducted on the estate. So it was in 2015 and conducted by Codima in a conjunction with Dublin City Council. Unfortunately, in 2018, so some resident of the Block 8 noticed some very serious structural issue in one of the staircase of the block, and so the block was emptied. There was a protest. And then in 2020, Dublin City Council announced new plans for regeneration, which were again abandoned and left, aside for a couple of years. And now they're, working. They're back on the plan and working on slightly revised plans for regeneration of the estate. And the new timeline of the regeneration is a starting date in 2027 and a completion date in 2029, but just for the first phase of the project. So it would only cover some of the blocks of the estate. And you have a couple of pictures on the right. Oh, sorry, a couple of pictures, if you can go back, yeah, of the structural issue in the staircase and the protest as well that followed. So yeah, very briefly, so we are, as mentioned, so we are starting surveying, conducting surveys in the apartment blocks, and collaborating with CATU, so the tenant union. So there's many issues. All issues we can imagine are just there in terms of environmental issues of all kinds, and there's a lack of about everything and every facility. So there's a lot of ongoing plumbing, pipe issue, water access issue. Some residents have to go regularly to the nearby shopping center to go to toilets and have a shower. There's weeks without hot water. There's pest infestation. Everything is really left to collapse and to rot, as Fia said, for decades now. So yeah, that's the kind of thing we are encountering on when doing surveys. And interestingly, as well, that like the retrofit project that was conducted on the estate, so in 2015, led to a number of issues in terms of actually heating control, temperature control. So some flats are over kind of much too hot, much too hot, much too warm, and so people are really baking in these flats. And there's a combination of, a flat being overheated with poor insulation, so all the energy is going, God knows where. And so, yeah, there's also this aspect of the kind of outcome of the retrofit project that was done, so about 10 years ago on the estate, that we can also document in the research. And just, yeah, to conclude on this slide, and I'll go quickly through the other ones. Really what we noticed for now is really that retrofitting is really, but probably everyone knows here, that it's just one part of the issue, of course, and it's part of a much wider web of really interconnected environmental issues faced by public housing tenants in the estate, and obviously at wider scale as well. So yeah, just to finish the key points, I guess I hear it all the time, actually, being part of different environmental groups. And I think there's a perception that many many citizens of Ireland don't actually care about climate change, and about retrofitting, about what to do to be more sustainable. But the reality on the ground, and at least as we can see it in Crown Castle Court, is that resident and social housing tenants there have been campaigning for decades to get housing conditions that would be also climate friendly in a way. So I think we need to be maybe to continue spread awareness on this campaign. Yeah, one resident in one of the other complex we've been to was saying, yeah, you hear on the radio about retrofitting every day, but I've been trying for years to get new doors and new windows. And yeah, so these campaigns really do exist, are very strong for decades on the ground. Yeah, just one last thing, sorry. This is really the last. So yeah, I think one of the questions we are asking ourselves as a researcher, and we'd be happy to engage about these as well, is what are the effects at the end? What are the effects of framing the campaign? In terms of retrofitting, in terms of climate justice, more than in terms of maybe environmental justice, wider environmental justice, maintenance issues, housing conditions issues. And I think that there is impact in terms of how we frame this campaign, and I think we need to be aware of these, and continue the discussion on what would be the effect of the campaign scope and how we frame the campaign as well. Yeah, as mentioned, there has been ongoing campaign for decades for better housing conditions, for instance. And if we maybe focus too much on climate and retrofitting, we might run the risk of erasing these campaign. The history of this campaign have been going on for like decades. And mobilizing, a large amount of tenants throughout Ireland as well for decades. Yeah, so just this, and trying to, as much as possible, also to keep links between again the campaign, between different issues and different conditions as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Fia. That was really good. So I think those are some really pertinent questions. We can maybe return to them when we do a little bit of Q&A at the end of this section, and also carry them into the breakout rooms to discuss more in depth. But yeah, thank you for your contribution. I think the case study is really useful as well. So yeah, taking all that on board, I'm going to talk a little bit about why a campaign, and why do we think it makes sense to campaign on this, and what do we think sort of some of the avenues or opportunities for success are. First of all, I just wanted to very briefly define what we mean by a campaign, which is that it's a highly focused project with a clear objective that takes place over a well-defined time frame. It's strategically planned and coordinated to achieve clear-cut, realistic goals and objectives. So it's something that we're doing that's quite targeted, that's quite direct, and that has clear goals that it's setting out to achieve in a set time frame. So we'll be clear whether or not we have actually achieved them. The reason we think this is useful is because it is also very useful, of course, to have like wider advocacy or policy or pieces of work. But we also want a way to get people together, to mobilize people, to put pressure on about these things, and to put pressure on specific points so that we can achieve them and show that success matters. Success sets a benchmark for further victories, and that in all of our campaigning and all of our work, we're never going to get exactly what we're looking for 100% of the time, the full program. But if we can find particular ways to escalate and win reforms that can demonstrate to our supporters, to our base, that we care about this issue and that we can organize on it to win, and it can lay the groundwork for future victories thereafter. So I think that's why it's really important to think about like what is strategic for building support and actually achieving a victory in order to set an example for further campaigning. Next slide, please. So why do we think that this one in particular makes sense? So as kind of covered by some of the other speakers, tenants are most excluded by retrofitting in general, with least ability to change it. So obviously, like there's other people that are excluded by the current retrofitting schemes, and so on, like, you know, people in perhaps very old houses or one-off rural houses. But tenants as a block are have basically no agency in this situation. There's a what is called the split incentive, where you know, it is of very little benefit for landlords to retrofit a tenant's property, particularly if tenants foot the bills, as they do in certain circumstances. So why would they do that? And it's of utmost importance for tenants that they live in warm homes, but they are not able to access the grant schemes because they're not geared towards them, and it's not their property to modify. Tenants are a growing population in Ireland, and one that is becoming increasingly, you know, agitated, and like, you know, the housing crisis is a particular point of concern for people in Ireland, and is still top of the agenda for many politicians and individuals to see fixed. So it is, as other people have pointed out, inherently a climate justice issue if people are forced to live in cold, damp, leaky homes, which are more reliant on fossil fuels, more emitting, and leaves people in worse circumstances. And so, yeah, so there's the justice aspect of it. And then there's the fact that people have pointed out there's already commitments that the government have made towards minimum BER targets, both in the private rental sector and in social housing. So it's not like we're asking for something that's outrageously off the table. These are things that has already been committed to by the current administration. I know obviously we're facing into a general election, as we all know, but these are not like, you know, revolutionary demands. These are things that are very achievable within like the current government program, and it's something that they failed to deliver on themselves. So there's a kind of pressure point there. Next slide. So I won't run through this again because this is very similar to what Claire said, but basically, to reiterate, we're calling for a minimum BER by 2026, an introduction of specific tenant protections to address situations where a landlord wants to retrofit a property to ensure tenants aren't unfairly evicted or facing significant rent increases because of these improvements. Next slide. Sorry, next slide, please.
I'll go to the next one.
Sorry,
Thank you, from Zarin. I don't know if I'm the problem, if you are.
No, that was me. That was me. Everything froze for a second. And yes, the other things we're calling for are retrofitting all social housing, retrofitting the worst performing homes first, in contrast to what Fia said earlier, where they're prioritizing better insulated homes because it's more cost efficient. You know, we think that the justice aspect is really important, and that it actually should be those who are in the lowest standard of accommodation who should be prioritized. And yes, expansion of the warmer home scheme to include properties rented by tenants on HAP, with the condition of a 5-year plus lease being offered to the tenant. And there's a picture of myself and Claire at the cost of living demo, I think 2 years ago now, so with our little heater homes, not the planet placards. Anyway, next slide, please. So there's opportunities and strengths to this. There are weaknesses as well. So I will get onto that in a second. So I think one of the things that's really exciting or advantageous about this is there are situations where we can bring a lot of people together who have similar issues to really drive the point home. So for example, the example of Cromcastle Court that was mentioned, there's a clear community, you know, shared tenancy interest in that complex being appropriately retrofitted. And as people are already coming together on that, and that's the case, you know, in lots of different places around the city. The most obvious example is public housing or social housing, where, you know, tenants tend to be all under the same roof. But there's also, you know, the private rental sector is becoming increasingly centralized. You know, there's still a lot of small landlords in the sector, but 20%, I believe, of all properties in Dublin in the last census were owned by landlords with rental properties were owned by landlords with over 100 properties. So there are a lot of like, you know, investment funds, real estate investment trusts coming into the market, and they don't always necessarily have high energy efficiency properties themselves. There's an assumption that there's a degree of professionalism, but that's not always the case. And there's again situations for residents to come together on what's a common issue that could be really effective for mobilizing people to take action in ways that maybe more individual approaches aren't. There's also the emissions reduction aspect, which we feel is very important. So HAP, private rental and social housing are some of the, and particularly public housing, are some of the leakiest homes in terms of increased emissions. So, I mean, and HAP in particular, we think that that's an issue because, you know, that's state money that is going to landlords in to supply housing to what are like people who would be on the housing list and eligible for public housing or social housing, but are basically forced into the private rental market due to low stock because we've not built sufficient public housing in this country. So this is actually a kind of a real issue if we're paying significant sums of taxpayer money to private landlords for people to live in inadequate housing that is also bad on an emissions level. And so I think that's something that's really important that needs to be tackled, and that's why we're pushing for those minimum energy requirements in private rental housing. The next government will definitely feel under pressure to deliver on housing. I think that's a given, regardless of who it is, based off of how the situation has gone for the last number of years and based off of current polling on people's issues and attitudes. And I think there's also a strong point here, which is that it's aligned with other Friends of the Earth groups and other environmental groups internationally. And there's examples of legislation in other countries. Again, like this is not something that's totally new that we've cooked up ourselves. There have been efforts to introduce this in the UK, for example, and there are examples of like best practice that we can draw on to kind of make a stronger case and to also kind of act in solidarity with people that are organizing in other countries. You know, part of the inspiration for this actually came from a presentation myself and Claire saw from Alliance Citoyenne, which are a kind of a French tenants union who have been working explicitly on this issue with Friends of the Earth in France and Greenpeace and a number of other groups. And I think it's a really inspiring model that we can take and adapt to our context. Next slide. There are also weaknesses. There's no perfect campaign, and the housing crisis is a complex beast, which I think makes this it adds additional challenges to this. So tenants are a smaller proportion of the population than, you know, homeowners or mortgage payers, etc. And they're concentrated in cities and towns. And in general, they lack institutional power, like they're relative to, say, property owners. They're not given the same amount of credence and policy, and they tend to be younger and maybe from more diverse backgrounds, which maybe means that they're disregarded a bit more. So like, you know, I think there are efforts to try and build institutional power amongst tenants, but that doesn't necessarily exist as of yet. There's also the fact that what I've hinted at earlier is that rural homes, including owner-occupied ones, are generally worse for fossil fuel usage. But this is a very complex topic. We did look at this as perhaps a campaign to focus on, but there was a lot of additional kind of complexity introduced by how one-off a lot of rural housing is, why solid fuels are used, and you know the level of kind of tailored insulation approaches that would need to be taken in some cases. So and based off of the fact that, like, just, you know, practically as Friends of the Earth, we don't have necessarily a lot of supporters or mobilization capacity in more rural areas. That's not to say this isn't something that should be built towards, but again, for something that, you know, has opportunity and that we can kind of push the envelope a bit on, we thought it would be easier to start with something where, you know, we have a lot of supporters in cities and we see that there are opportunities to do stuff around housing there. And the housing crisis, I think this is the kind of the big one, and it was alluded to in the comments in the chat, and I think it's one we can talk about a little bit in the Q&A and the breakouts. Is there's a real fear of bringing in new regulations, particularly anything that might require landlords to you know, supply higher quality housing, because there's the perception that landlords will flee the market, you know, and that sell up their properties and then, you know, it'll lie vacant, or it'll be sold to you know, someone to live in, and then it won't be a rental property or what have you. So I think that this is quite a challenging argument to overcome. And And for example, this is why there was the effort to lift the eviction ban after the end of COVID, because it was argued that landlords were suffering unduly under the fact that they had to offer certain protections to tenants, and that the investment wouldn't be as lucrative because they couldn't as easily kind of regain control of it. I mean, I think that this is one that we absolutely have to counter, but I don't think that this is an insurmountable barrier. I think, for example, like, we shouldn't be arguing against that we should not be arguing that anybody has to live in substandard property, and that, like, there's a question as to how much carrot or how much stick needs to be applied here. But the simple fact of the matter is, unless there are regulations that are brought in to limit what can be rented out, and for landlords to upgrade their current stock, then there's not going to be any improvement on this, because, like we said, there's no incentive for landlords to do it at present, realistically. And part of that is also putting in place the regulation that says that there are these minimum standards to kind of bring properties up to scratch. And that's the only way that we will actually deal with the emissions aspect. That's the only way we'll actually deal with the social justice aspect and stop people living in leaky homes. So it is an essential part of the puzzle. But I think there is a challenge in the wider housing crisis and how that relates. But that's something that I don't think that we should shy away from tackling. And like I said, there's this question about how much pros and how much carrot and how much stick to introduce. Okay. So this here is kind of the current plan as to the campaign launch. So what we're planning on, so this is the first step really of the launch, in a broad sense. We're not launching it here tonight. This was our kind of first initial forum to get a sense for feedback and opinions. But we are also working this into our general election 2024 campaigning as of present. So I believe Simon Harris has said the election's now going to happen probably November 29th. He's come out and basically explicitly said that. So we know this is happening, and we're organizing a number of events as Friends of the Earth to put pressure on all parties running for election to commit to this in their program for government. So we are organizing hustings of candidates. We're organizing climate justice days of action, and I'll come back to some of these towards the end to let you know how to get involved. But we're taking advantage of the political moment to start with to raise these demands initially. We are also planning on applying pressure around the program for government negotiations. So depending on how the election goes, these could be very short negotiations or they could be very protracted. But we were planning on organizing something around December, potentially some kind of a stunt to keep the pressure on and to let the issue not drop off the radar. And we will be back in more contact about that. We're also going to identify areas at risk of energy poverty with concentrations of tenants. So this is going to happen more so kind of in the new year. So there are some very useful bits of research done that map kind of social deprivation indices to BER ratings of properties to determine what areas are potentially more at risk of energy poverty than others. And really, we want to start getting this campaign out there in the real world. I think part of what is important about this issue is the fact that it presents a vision of climate justice that isn't just abstract and linked to high-level policy and emissions, but it matters in people's daily lives, whether or not they can have a safe, warm home to live in. And I think why that's important is it can help broaden and expand the climate movement and bring new people into this, and consider that their life material issues are climate issues. And so I think it's really important to start bringing this out into the real world and start talking to people about it on the streets, on their doors, in their communities. So that's kind of the next phase of it, is we're going to get out and start knocking on doors and actually building the campaign in person. And then, it's a question of how it develops from there. So we're planning on kind of bringing our community level demands to politicians, media and landlords as necessary, depending on the current, depending on the context and who the decision maker is in that situation, and then escalate it and replicate it and scale that up across different communities. So we will be producing like materials and briefings on this when we formally launch the campaign in the new year. But this is essentially the pilot trial that we want to run to test its effectiveness. Okay, so we're a little bit over time, but I think it's important that we have space for questions. I know that there's a lot in the chat already. I might see if there's any that we can pick up that are particularly interesting for people. So, I mean, the first one is the question of tax relief for landlords. Maybe just if you want to respond to that, Fia, for the recording. So for who can avail of the tax relief for landlords?
Oh, right, sorry. Yeah, I didn't have the figure exactly to hand about the number of properties. But yeah, the question was like whether that tax incentive is available to corporate landlords. My understanding is it's not. It's like solely landlords who are operating as like a private individual, and who own less than 5 rental properties. If I remember right, it could be slightly more or slightly less than that.
Sonia seems to imply it's less than that.
Yeah, it's 2.
Okay, thanks.
I saw, Sonia, there that you had that question about the minimum BER ratings on the HAP properties and would that affect supply? Do you want to ask that as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a crisis with HAP properties at the moment. I don't know why there are so few available HAP properties, but I mean, I remember looking at one once, and it was not that long ago. There was like 2 in Dublin. You know, if it's that bad, and you know, I agree with you that everybody deserves to live in a warm house, but is there any strategy? Because basically this is the wall that people have come up against with the HAP all the time, is the fact that it's already difficult to get people to accept HAP clients, HAP tenants. Is that going to make things even worse? And I mean, I know this is what you've just discovered again. You just discussed this, but it is a valid point. It's already a crisis, and is there a strategy to square the circle and the square, square the circle? Is there any strategy to get around this? I mean, this is not your job. This is the government's job. But I mean, is there any suggestions that you can even think of? Or is that something we need to think of right now?
Yeah, I might let Claire respond first and then Kat from Threshold, if that's okay.
Yeah, I didn't actually realize Threshold here. That's great. Thanks, Kat. One of the things that we are calling for, and this is actually off the back of research that Threshold and St. Vincent de Paul did a couple of years ago, but was for calling for the free retrofit scheme to be expanded to HAP properties. So on the condition of a longer term lease being offered. And our proposal on minimum BERs is for all rental properties. So it's not just for HAP tenants, it's for all rental properties. So it's not going to be a specific thing that we're just on HAP properties. But to get around that, I guess we were putting forward Threshold and SVP's proposal on allowing those homes to avail of the free retrofit scheme. Kat, I don't know if you want to expand on that further.
Yeah, no, that's basically it. And also, I think a key issue with HAP is it is a temporary measure because we don't have social housing stock currently, and B, and key to this, and I think needs to be tied in with this demand for HAP tenants to receive this, is we need to look at HAP rates. So the reason there's so few HAP properties is because there's a cap rate of like, I forget what it is, but it depends on how much you make and everything. That cap hasn't been addressed since like 2016. So obviously the private rental sector prices are wildly different now than they were in 2016. So I think I don't want to take over friends of theirs, feel free to disagree with me, but it might be good to tie in looking and reviewing HAP rates with this. Because also another thing is the HAP tenants are at risk then, because within RPZs and of course outside of RPZs, extensive renovation is an acceptable reason for the price to increase for your rent. So I see you have the protection for tenants in that. I just want to stress that, and also say that during the tenancy as well, like if a retrofit is happening, where is that tenant going to go? And so that is a huge issue as well with HAP tenants. But again, if we have HAP rates reviewed and more properties are available for HAP, then maybe that wouldn't be as big of an issue.
Yeah, if I could respond to that as well. I think like this is part of the reason that we felt it was useful to hold this forum, this space, because these are questions that we have been considering. You know, how much can we really disentangle this from the wider housing crisis and the crisis of supply and supply of public and affordable housing and what have we? And like we as an organization want to keep the focus as much as possible on climate and the emissions aspect and tying in the social justice to that. But I think those are really valid points that you raise, Sonia, and you raise, Kat, is that like, you know, we can take that stance of like, we believe it's a moral right that people should have a right to live in, you know, warm and safe homes, and that it's positive from a climate perspective as well. But it is an open question as to how much do we bring in those calls for wider reform of, you know, the housing sector, or things like the HAP thresholds, or things like how do we get more, you know, affordable or social houses on stream. And I think, you know, we maybe don't have 100%, you know, final decision on where we fall on that yet. But I think that's really important to have these conversations now so that we can decide like how do we build the most watertight message possible on this, so that we don't necessarily, you know, get tie ourselves in knots, or present like a weak version of our arguments. And I think Claire's point there is as well is also a good question about HAP rates, in that like, you know, the issue of like in the long term, is that not transferring more money to landlords, or and is that not an inflationary measure with rents? So maybe Kat, if you want to respond to that, and then I might actually start to bring in the breakout rooms, because we're kind of getting into those discussions anyway.
Yeah, no, Claire, you're preaching to the choir, man. Like hardcore agree. HAP was meant to be a temporary measure that was supposed to be out by now. So HAP is not working, and the only way we can get rid of HAP is to increase our social housing supply. So social and cost rental is what we're calling for. We would like 20% of all housing stock to be social and cost rental. That would create a unitary housing system that we would not need HAP anymore.
Okay. Claire, do you mind just pulling up the next slide after the question section with the breakout room discussion points, just so we can people can see, so then we can load into that. So I'm gonna stop recording now for a start.